Welcome to the Future of Resolution, Miles Mediation and Arbitration's podcast. In this episode of the Future of Resolution, Miles CEO John Miles sits down with Rex Smith, who's widely considered one of the top dispute resolution experts in the country. Rex recently joined Miles's panel in Atlanta, and in this episode, he opens up about this recent change and he provides helpful advice for attorneys and neutrals.
Well, Rex, it's really a pleasure for me to finally be here. First official day at Miles, and a part of this podcast. I know you and have gotten to know you better as we've engaged in this process of discussing this next chapter in your career. But for the purposes of those listening, tell me a little bit about Rex Smith growing up, early years.
Certainly. Well, I was blessed to be born in Heard County, Georgia, to lovely parents, and all my family's from there. I have an aunt that got into genealogy, and as far as I know, both sides of the family went back to like the 1850s in Heard County, Georgia. So long time resident. My dad moved a little bit, but that was always home, and eventually moved to the outskirts of Atlanta and opened a hardware store in Riverdale, Georgia. So I graduated high school at Jonesboro, Georgia. So I was a fighting Cardinal, and we were always playing the Lions and the Bears and the Eagles, which I thought was a tad unfair. College, I finished at Georgia State, was just exceedingly lucky to be accepted at the University of Georgia and graduated law school in Georgia.
Now, I started practicing in 1988, and at that time, the Georgia bar book, with the pictures, wasn't even an inch thick,
Right.
You've seen changes even before you began your career as a neutral in the bar. How has the bar changed since you graduated from the University of Georgia and began practicing?
Well, it's much larger, as you're pointing out. It's also much more sophisticated. I think the areas of specialty and people moving into specialties earlier in their career and becoming very, very talented in a particular area. I think the plaintiff's bar is significantly more sophisticated. They cooperate with each other. They have different areas of specialty that they sort of make rolling law firms as they go along, depending on the nature of what they need. On the defense side, you now see, I'm not real sure what the largest law firm in Atlanta was in 1976. I suspect it was King and Spalding, and I suspect it was less than 100 lawyers. So the growth on both sides in terms of sophistication and talent and specialization has been very significant over the last years of my career. Absolutely.
In my case, my wife, Jamie, is also a lawyer. We met at Emory. And that was the first class, if memory serves, that there were more women attending law school than there were men. The bar has become more diverse.
Dramatically so. When I was a first-year student in 1973, out of 240 students, the third-year class had 4 women. The second-year class had 16, and then my class had 40. So women were beginning to be accepted into the law schools very rapidly, from almost 0 to 40 to, I'm not exactly sure, so 1988, more than 50%. I know that my middle son, Walter, graduated there. You'd think I know exactly, but I think it was 2004, I think. And I think it was like 55-45.
Now, when you were practicing, and you began practicing with Mabry McClellan?
Henning.
Oh, that's
Chambers
right.
and Mabry.
That's right.
And then it became Chambers, Mabry, McClellan, and Brooks, and then Mabry and McClellan.
Okay.
Right.
So you saw this transformation, both in terms of complexity and diversity, firsthand as you were practicing.
Oh, yes. Very much so, which I think both developments are obviously very good things. Absolutely.
How did it change for you as a lawyer, the types of cases you worked on, the opposing counsel you dealt with, clients that you represented? How did that change?
That's an interesting question. The first 2 years I was practicing law, we just tried cases. We didn't have any real expertise or any assistance in settling cases.
Rex, certainly that change in complexity of type of practice and the diversity came of age as you were practicing. How did that impact the way that you practice law?
That's an interesting question, and it's kind of a multifaceted answer. Well, number one of my mentors was Bo Chambers. He was the person who hired me, he along with Ed Henning. But at that time, Bo had an extraordinarily active trial practice. If I'm not mistaken, I sat second chair in 40 cases in the first 2 years. We were either in trial or preparing for trial constantly, and we really didn't have I never heard the word mediation. I didn't know anything about a mediator. We didn't really have any formal way to resolve lawsuits other than the old courthouse steps aspect of it, which really didn't work that well. So we tried an awful lot of cases. And then immediately thereafter, when I started taking cases myself, nobody would let you try a case if it was worth anything. So I was trying what I call left turn chiropractor cases. Just one right after another. But it was an excellent way to learn the craft. It really was. But as you did more and had more experience, people had confidence in you, they would let you start dealing with more complex and difficult cases. I was very lucky in the sense that I got a client that did nothing but products liability work when I was in my third year out. So I started doing a lot of products liability work. Traveled all over the country. So here I am, 30 years old, handling these somewhat difficult cases. And it just kind of grew from there. As you handle one, it would lead you to another. I did an awful lot of swimming pool death cases, and I did an awful lot of cases that ended up with relatively severe injuries and had some degree of complexity to them. And eventually got Delta Airlines as a client, which took me all over the country doing cases with Delta, and developed a specialty in brain injury, did a lot of brain injury work. So individually, it just kind of gradually changed over time. But for the bar itself, I think a lot of it was driven by the growth in Atlanta. If I'm not mistaken, when I was in high school, you could go down to the Darlington Apartments on Peachtree Street, and it wasn't 1 million people. I think that sign is it 6, 7, or 8 million now?
It's got to be that, yeah.
So we've had this incredible growth, and we've seen our hometown companies like Delta just become major international players. We've seen companies from all over put either their national or their regional headquarters here. So the sophistication of the work in Atlanta has grown as Atlanta's grown. So we're blessed to live in an environment where we've had so much growth. All of us have had our careers enhanced by the increase in population and the growth as we've gone forward.
And speak to the diversity of the bar. That certainly had changed a great deal. Did that impact the way you practice?
John, I don't know that it's impacted the way that I've practiced, but it's certainly a huge factor and a good factor as more and more people from more and more walks of life, different experiences come together and look at problems. You just have a greater array of diversity coming to try to resolve problems. It's been a great thing for our city, for our state, for our country, and particularly for the bar itself.
I agree with that. Randy Kessler did the last podcast, and I was listening to it, and Randy said something very interesting. He's a New Orleans native, and he was asked, well, why, Atlanta? And he said, Atlanta's amazing because you can come and be whatever you want to be in Atlanta.
Right.
And there's no cultural stigma. And then he added, and it's got the greatest airport in the world, so if you don't like it, you can get on a plane and
go somewhere else.
But I thought that was interesting. I never thought of Atlanta in that way, but I think that pertains to the bar too. I mean, not only do you, as you said, you have this diversity of and complexity and specialization to a degree, but you have a number of lawyers from different life perspectives of race, religion, sex. It's quite interesting in Atlanta. I think it benefits us all.
Absolutely.
Talk to me about how you made the transition. You were obviously having a very successful law practice, so why the move to mediation?
Well, like everything else in my life, it's just luck. But the truth of the matter is I got a call from Clay Porter one day, and Clay asked if I would mediate a case for him. And I said, I don't know anything about mediation. And so, Clay, that's not what I'm not, no.
Do you know why Clay decided to call you?
Yes, because he called back to tell me why. So about a week later, after I told him that I really didn't do that, he called back and he said, Rex, everybody knows you. It's a brain injury case. There's no question on liability. It's just the complexity of the science on it. Would you do it for us anyway? And I said, well, if everybody will sign a waiver, blah, blah, blah. And we got together and we did it, and it went till about midnight, and we got it settled. And I was like, this is really cool. So I decided that I would take the mediation class, and at that time it was down at Resolute Resources. And I went down and took the class and got registered, and I was asked to give a talk, and the topic I was given was removing contingencies from mediations. And so I went down and gave that talk, and for whatever it's worth, I thought it'd be 20 or 30 people like you would have at a typical CLE. Well, I get down there, it's about 300 people. And I gave the talk, and I had people calling and asking, and so I decided I would try to become a mediator, and called Ed Henning, who I'd worked with before. And Ed, in his unbelievably enthusiastic way, said, absolutely, Rex. And it sort of started from there.
So at that point, Rex had left the firm and had established his company.
Ed had, yes. And there's another twist to that conversation, too. The other piece of the puzzle is I thought this would be something I'd do when I retired and had no intention of becoming a full-time. But to make a long story short, I had a younger lawyer in the firm come in on a Monday and said, I'm in a really bad pickle. I have a real bad case that I got to try next Monday, and I haven't done anything. And I said, what do you mean you haven't done anything? And he said, I haven't done anything. He had answered the lawsuit, and to make a long story short, he was just such a good worker that he'd kind of had a little bit of a breakdown. And I didn't catch it. Nobody else caught it. And so the way we decided to deal with it was if the case had to be tried next Monday, I would try it. One of my other partners, Walter McClellan, would try to get it continued. And to make a long story short, I was going home on Wednesday to tell my wife that I wouldn't be at Thanksgiving at our house on Thursday because I had to get ready for this trial. And Walter called and said, I got it continued. And I was sitting right in front of the Wesley Chapel Methodist Church. And I looked over at that church and I said, I'm going to go a different way. And that's the moment I decided that I would be a full-time mediator.
Less stress.
It could have been any more stress than that.
Oh.
My client wore 2 pistols and had a cowboy hat, and he made a product that hurt people, and he was going to come down and tell the judge what he thought about this judicial system.
Good one to avoid.
I was in deep trouble.
You know, you mentioned, Ed, and one of the things I say to anyone who will listen that what we've been able to do here at Miles, what I've been able to achieve to some degree, I walk in the footsteps of Ed Henning. He was just an extraordinary visionary. Really, I think it's not too much to say, in Georgia at least, was the pioneer for ADR. Talk to me a little bit about Ed.
Well, Ed Henning was a wonderful man, just a wonderful man, as is his wife. Helen is a wonderful lady. He was always kind and very gracious to me. I sat right across the hall from him when my first office, and one thing I remember very specifically is very early we needed to hire a secretary. And Ed asked me which of 2 I wanted. And I said, well, I think this one would be good. He said, no, I think this other one would be good. And she ended up being my secretary for over 30 years. So Ed was very good in picking out very talented people. Charlene was my secretary and just was a wonderful addition in my life, too. Ed tells a story that when he first started mediating, the bar filed a bar complaint against him because he was representing both sides. And he went down and said, no, here's my contract. I don't represent anybody. So he was so early that the bar didn't.
The bar wasn't even there.
Exactly. But in terms of honesty and integrity, in terms of being a good person and a great lawyer, that was it, Henning.
Well, you mentioned, Rex, that kind of early in your law practice, you kind of took some baby steps, trying a bunch of cases and to kind of get going. Was that similar in your mediation practice, or did you kind of leap right into the larger matters?
That's an interesting question, but the short answer is it seemed like very early I would have cases that had some degree of complexity or large numbers of parties in it. I had a case where we had 9 different defendants like within the first month, and I think we went till like 3 o'clock in the morning on that case because it had so many different moving parts. So relatively early was handling cases that had large numbers of parties and sometimes significant aspects of the case.
Did you love it right from the start, like
Absolutely.
you did practicing law, or was it even more?
I tell people I liked being a lawyer. I really liked it a lot. I would wake up every morning with kind of an enthusiasm about what I was going to do. Now, it's hard work, and it had stresses, and everybody that does this type of work knows that, but I liked it. I've been to every state in the union, met people from all walks of life, but I love being a mediator.
Well, it's interesting because I've had the privilege of working alongside a number of neutrals. With a few exceptions, it usually, in my experience, takes a year or two to get to that full-time status where you're booking every day. But it sounds like in your case, that came relatively quickly.
It did come pretty quickly. It was surprising to me. I didn't have any idea that I would be booked as quickly as I was, but I enjoyed it very much. And literally after the Wesley Chapel Methodist Church moment, I told my partners I was going to be a full-time mediator, and was mainly governed by transitioning my files and clients to the firm and making myself available full-time.
We're in the business of resolving disputes, but we know how to have a good time. If you're listening to this, you're invited to join everyone at Miles and our clients for a fun night at City Winery on May 16th from 6 to 8 p.m. RSVP on our website at milesmediation.com.
This is a question I've given a lot of thought to, and I don't have an answer. I'd be interested in your response. I have 7 or 8 neutrals here that book every day, and they book, as you do, 6 weeks or more out. All come from different backgrounds, all have different personalities, yet all enormously successful. In other words, the legal community has sampled their skill set, their talents, and says, I need to come back and utilize that. Even if I have to wait, that's the person I want to work. What do you think is that commonality that leads to someone so quickly reaching that level?
John, I don't know if I have an answer to that question. I kind of think of us as scissors. I don't want to call us tools.
Yeah, I'd avoid tools.
Tools.
Yeah.
Sometimes you need a pair of hedge clippers, that you need someone who has strength and force, and then sometimes you have a very delicate problem. You need a pair of surgical scissors that can get into a very tiny little place. To me, it's different personalities. The skill sets may be very similar, but how they relate to people. You may have one mediator that works much better in this setting than the same mediator just because of the personalities that are involved. Sometimes you need the blue ribbon mediator. You need someone who has a lot of experience. A lot of times, I think people like Susan Forsling here, that you have a person who is going to respect a judge who has tried these cases from the judicial point of view, that people want that type of seniority, that type of sophistication. Sometimes you may want someone who has spent a lot of time in medical malpractice cases, or you need someone that's spent a lot of time in products liability cases. But a lot of times, I think it's the personalities. I tease a little bit. I think to do this well, you have to have a little bit of a psychologist in you. You need a little bit of a preacher in you in certain cases. It helps tremendously if you have a real good command of how the courts work.
Yes.
So to answer the question, I don't know what the commonality is, but it seems to me that there are different skill sets and different personalities for different cases.
I agree with that, and that's something that a conclusion I've come to as well. I also have found that of my neutrals that have been successful, there's a passion for what they do. And I think that translates into a work ethic. I love what you have in your emails. The mediation's not over until the jury knocks. And I think that speaks to something that's common with neutrals that have had a great deal of success, and that is, I'm not going to give up on this. I almost take it personally,
Right.
If a case doesn't settle. So I think that's part of it as well. And I think that you mentioned Susan. Susan is always prepared. She will read everything that you send. I know the same is true of you and the others of my neutrals that are successful. They're not going to come in not knowing the case. So there's a lot of moving parts there, but there's no doubt in my mind that, as Joe Murphy, one of my seniors here, says, there are more people earning their living playing professional baseball in Atlanta than there are neutrals who book out as far as you guys do. So there certainly is a combination of things, but there's no question about the results.
Well, to follow up on your point, if you don't have a strong work ethic in virtually anything, any walk of life, whatever you do, whether you're a farmer or a judge or whether you're in business, running a business, if you don't have the work ethic, you're much less likely to be successful. I speak on mediation often, and one of my slides talks about preparing for the mediation. As the advocate, you have to prepare for it just like you prepare for trial. Well, I try to bring that same mentality to preparing to mediate the case. I always want to get as much information as I can. I like to have phone calls ahead of time to get the nuances. One time I called someone to ask to introduce myself and get started in the case, and the gentleman said, "Well, isn't this improper? Aren't we having an ex parte communication?" I said, "Yeah, but what do you think we're going to be having all day tomorrow?" So I am what I would call an activist mediator, and I think that's a huge part of it.
That's another good point, yeah.
To get as much information as you can, try to understand the personalities, the problems, try to have private conversations as early as you possibly can to put ourselves in the best posture for success. And putting the mediator in the best posture for success is reading and studying and knowing the case as well as you possibly can when you walk in there.
One of the things that I've seen is I've kind of transitioned my practice from being a neutral to, running the organization is there was a time 2 years ago that if we did 70 mediations in a month, that was considered quite a good month. Now, routinely, we do more than 200 mediations in a month. Yes, we've added folks, but that doesn't account for the growth. My sense, Rex, is that mediation itself is becoming more popular. Do you share that?
Oh, yes. I think it's institutionalized.
You kind of anticipated my next question, right?
Because it works. The success rate is extremely high, particularly if you carry it out from not only the day of the mediation, but up until trial. I mean, it's in the 90s if you include all the way up to trial. So many of the companies realize that it works from the defense side and that they need to get to that decision point. They need to gather the information they need to make decisions about a case, and they can save a considerable amount of money and expenses and in time if they can resolve the cases earlier. So they institutionalize. They ask their lawyers to prepare the case for trial, but the first step is prepare it to mediation. And that's happening, I think, all over. From the plaintiff's point of view, for the family themselves or the plaintiff's attorneys, the earlier they can resolve the case, the better. Saves them tremendous amount of time and expense. So the system simply works, and that's why I believe that you're seeing lots of growth in all of the different services and individuals that are doing it too.
One of the things that I battled early in my career was kind of a sense, not always, but every once in a while you'd get one of our brothers or sisters on the defense bar saying, well, you're taking food off my table, or, I'm kind of against it but I don't hear that anymore. I kind of feel like they've like they say, hey, if I want to succeed as a litigator, I better also succeed as being able to represent my client at mediation.
Right. One of the beauties about mediation, I think, from both sides, is that if you're going to do it successfully, in the morning, you have advocates. They have to articulate their case and advocate their position. If you're doing it well and you're doing it right, in the afternoon, they become counselors.
That's well said.
What is our best decision from here? And if it works well, you have really good advocates in the morning and really good counselors in the afternoon.
That's well said. I never thought of it that way. Well, Rex, as our bars become larger here in Georgia, it's become more diverse. You got certainly more of these attorneys participating in ADR. What advice would you give? I mean, what do you see that works? What do you see that doesn't work? Or if you could wave a magic wand, what would you want attorneys to know?
I go back to my point. Prepare for mediation like you prepare for trial. And that's multifaceted. From the plaintiff's point of view, you need to prepare the decision makers on the other side to the best you can, to get them the information that you can as early as you possibly can. As we all know, you can't walk into mediation with the defense thinking the medical expenses are $60,000 and then show up and they're $600,000. It'll kill it. So prepare the other side as best you can. Prepare your client, because mediation is very different than trial. They're very different skills. The client needs to understand the process and needs to understand why you are working in a diplomatic way as opposed to an adversarial way. But it's also very important to prepare the mediator. You would never go to trial and call up a lawyer and say, look, I got a big case on Monday morning. We're going to start at 9. Meet me down there at 8. I'll tell you all about it, and you can try it from there. Same thing. Walking into mediation without preparing the mediator, you're just losing an edge, because what you want to do is have that mediator be an effective advocate for your point of view. And the more that they know, the more that they can understand the nuances of the case, the more successful they can do. So number one is just be prepared and prepare all the parties for the mediation.
And we've talked about in your career as a neutral, you've seen a lot of change. It's certainly become more accepted. It's become, as you say, more institutionalized. What do you think the future is for ADR?
John, I knew this question was coming, and I'm just going to be as honest as I can be about it. And that is, if you want to know the future of mediation, you need to ask John Miles, because I don't know anybody that spends more time thinking about how to make it better, how to expand it, what its future is than you. For me, every day I'm in the trenches looking at the problem. We have this particular problem, and I'm not looking at it from a global point of view where you are. And there may be 2 or 3 other people in Atlanta that I just don't know. But I would ask you, what's the future of mediation, John?
Turn the tables on the question.
Right.
Yeah, I do, Rex. As you said, I tell people it took me till I was 45 to figure out what I wanted to do. Like you, I came from an insurance defense background, made the transition to mediation, and boy, I loved it. I really did. But what I really found after a time was that what I really liked was building an organization and helping people. Growing up in central Minnesota, I always admired builders. I'd say, man, they can see something when they're gone, and that's just such an awesome thing. And honestly, from my perspective, and it was probably my failings as a litigator, I never felt that way. Even after a verdict, I enjoyed that for about the time it took me to get back to the car and start answering the mountain. I think I had your moment of looking over saying, I am not doing this anymore. And I really became energized by how could we do it better? How could we take folks in conflict, and how could we lead them to resolution in a way that was better for them, and at the same time made a nice living for the folks who trusted my vision. I really think that the future is going to be a growth in that. I think that, and you alluded to this, that you see a number of practitioners who earlier were hostile to the process, now who embrace the process. I see that neutrals are being elevated. When I started doing this, it was something you did when you retired, or it was something that you did if you couldn't really succeed, the old adage, those who can't teach kind of thing. Now I see that those who have had success doing this, and I agree with you that body of folks is growing, are held in tremendous esteem by the folks in the bar. I think that's going to continue. I think that as we use our platform, our marketing and branding platform, we're going to reach areas outside of litigation where people can benefit from the skill set of a neutral to help folks in corporate America deal with transition and deal with conflict, heading those things off before they become major issues. I also believe that brand, when I was coming up, Rex, knowing you were just known as the guy you go to for the large case. I know you wouldn't say that about yourself, but that was what was widely known in the bar. My thought was, well, gosh, why aren't there more Rex Smiths? Because there's only so many days in the week and or in the month, and only so many hours in the day, almost so much work you can do. So what if we could come up with a brand that is successful in recruiting, training, and then transitioning men and women to full-time status. And I'm happy to say we've had some success doing that. Unlike the practice of law, if it's litigation, you got to know what a Fulton County jury, or you got to know what a Gwinnett County jury. So many of these things, from mass tort to brain injury cases that you mentioned, corporate disputes, are more driven by the knowledge of the attorneys, certainly the parties, and the neutral. And those don't have geographic boundaries. So I really don't see any reason that our top neutrals, they can go to folks nationally, or those folks can come to us. So I really do think that the next iteration, if you will, of neutral, kind of a moving away from the independent contractor who networks and everyone knows them and their skill set, and that the brand becomes synonymous with excellence and with quality and so forth, so that anyone associated with that brand becomes acceptable to a larger, hopefully growing portion of both the legal community and the populace who accepts what we do and sees value in it.
Indeed.
Well, thank you, Rex. It's been wonderful getting a chance to sit down and talk with you, and welcome to Miles Mediation, and I think the future looks bright for both of us.
Well, I couldn't be more excited to be part of it. Thanks, John.
Thank you.
You've been listening to The Future of Resolution, the podcast. You can follow The Future of Resolution on Miles Mediation and Arbitration's Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. If you haven't yet, go to Apple Podcast, Stitcher, Spotify, and subscribe, rate, or review this podcast. Join us soon for another interesting discussion. Thank you for listening.